One of the questions that's often asked is Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Why is the blockade ongoing? Why was the blockade imposed? And are they any closer to reconciliation? Let's give the very brief answer, which is that these two countries are not close to reconciliation. Despite numerous attempts by Kuwait traveling between the two countries, despite rumors of initiatives being started by either of the two countries, the reality is that we're not closer to reconciliation. And in fact, we're actually closer to a possibility whereby Qatar may actually leave the GCC, or rather be kicked out by the GCC. One of those two scenarios. And in the event Qatar does leave the GCC, it's likely to be followed by one other Gulf country, which we don't need to mention at this point in time. What does that mean? It means the GCC will continue to operate within the countries that remain within the GCC. There will still be a blockade on Qatar, but at some point there will need to be some discussion between the two, given the geographic proximity and given the fact that at some point these countries' interests will converge once more, as they have done in the past. So what are the key issues with regards to the blockade? The reality is that it's impossible to understand the blockade without understanding what made Saudi Arabia so upset and so angry after decades of Saudi Arabia turning a blind eye to what it perceived as transgressions. Saudi's usual policy has always tended to be to sweep these issues and keep them under the carpet rather than letting them blow up into diplomatic crises. And we've seen that before in its relations with Libya, with Gaddafi's Libya, in its relations with Egypt, in its relations with Yemen. Saudi always prefers a policy of keeping things quiet, dealing with it behind closed doors. So this sudden burst, this open nature of the blockade, of Saudi Arabia blockading Qatar, is what's unusual. And that cannot be understood unless we understand what made Saudi Arabia so upset. And put simply, it was the Arab Spring. Now, I always say that the best way to understand this is to imagine yourself as an advisor to Saudi Arabia, an advisor to King Abdullah and the head of his royal court, who was once the most powerful man in the kingdom, Khalid al-Tuwaijri. And you've seen on the news that Tunisia, there's been an uprising and there's been a protest, there's been a revolution, and Ben Ali has been kicked out and he's asking for refugee status in your country. Initially, you will say that Tunisia is just a small country, not geographically, not of geostrategic importance, and therefore it's probably just an exception and not the rule. But then you see Egypt, people taken to the streets in Egypt, and Mubarak is forced to resign and he's imprisoned and he's put before a court process. Not only that, but you see that your ally, the US ally, Washington, has done nothing in order to rescue the Mubarak regime. The US is accepting that there's change taking place and it's monitoring the situation and readjusting and realigning its interests in order to adapt to the new status quo. In other words, US is not going to bail you out. Moreover, when the revolution begins in Libya, before it's hijacked by international powers, you see that NATO, not only is it standing neutral or sitting on the fence as perhaps it did in Tunisia or Egypt, now it's actively engaging in changing the regime, in bringing down Gaddafi, in trying to make sure that these protests succeed in achieving their aims, which is to bring down Gaddafi, not the aims for independent country or freedom or democracy. We're talking aims insofar as it is to bring down the regime, to bring down Gaddafi. So you've seen the US is not intervening to rescue its allies, and you've also seen that NATO is now proactively engaging in changing regimes. So as Saudi Arabia, how do you feel? You've seen that these protests now, from Tunisia to Egypt to Libya, it's getting closer and closer. It's coming in from that western border. And after Egypt, the border is Saudi Arabia straight after that. Where does Qatar fit in all of this? Al Jazeera, the Qatar-owned channel, was the main media outlet that was delivering the news of the Arab Spring. Al Jazeera was deemed to be fanning the flames. Al Jazeera was covering the protest to great extent and sending those pictures from Maidan al-Tahrir, Tahrir Square, from Shara Bourguiba, from Bourguiba Street, bringing in all of the pundits to discuss who were agitating the flames of revolution. By the way, we're not talking about whether the revolution was right or wrong. We're talking about the perspective that Qatar was backing the revolution, backing the Arab Spring, backing the protest, which it was. So Saudi Arabia is seeing that Qatar is fueling and fanning these flames. But so far, all of it is coming from the West. Then we see to the southern border, Yemen. Yemen goes through its own transition. There are protests. Saudi Arabia decides to react here and decides to proactively engage in bringing about a national dialogue, bringing about a government, a smooth transition in order to try to contain the impact of the revolution, to make sure that it doesn't come into Saudi Arabia. Moreover, Saudi Arabia bloats the public sector, increases public sector pay packages, and gives other benefits to citizens in order to try to fend off the Arab Spring. And we actually see a series of meetings behind closed doors with the Qataris, in which the Saudis say to the Qataris, listen, we are a bunch of kingdoms here. We all rely on one another. Please don't fan the flames and bring this Arab Spring to us here to the kingdom, to Saudi Arabia. And these meetings actually took place. But whether Saudi Arabia actually intended on waiting to hear Qatar's response is a different issue entirely. However, what is clear is that Saudi Arabia believed that it was now in an existential crisis. They had Iran controlling Iraq to its northern border. Syria, a bit further north, descended into civil war as a result of the protests. To the south, Yemen, upheaval, political change, everybody uncertain about where Yemen is going. And to the west, the most powerful country in the Arab world, Egypt, has undergone an Arab Spring. And not only has it undergone an Arab Spring, and this is the other dynamic that upsets Saudi Arabia, it is Qatar's allies who have won the elections. The Muslim Brotherhood are in control of Egypt. The Muslim Brotherhood are in control of Tunisia. The Muslim Brotherhood are the main power that have been brought to power by NATO intervention in Libya. So when we're looking at these changes, these dynamics, Saudi Arabia suddenly believed that it was in an existential crisis and that it had to react in order to survive. Moreover, the situation was compounded by an ensuing succession struggle within Saudi Arabia between the various different princes that was only really resolved de facto in 2020, but in name at least in 2017 when bin Salman came to power. So what does Saudi Arabia decide to do? Saudi Arabia decides to team up with the UAE and launch a counterattack. It backs Sisi in Egypt, it supports anti-Muslim Brotherhood movements in Tunisia, and supports Haftar in Libya in a bid to push back against this Arab Spring, to make sure that it does not come to Saudi Arabia. Instead of relenting, Qatar decides to up the ante, to respond. The media coverage, Arabic and English-owned media coverage on every tiny detail of Saudi Arabia. We see both sides, Saudi and the Qataris and the UAE, throwing out accusations, terrorism, extremism, radicalism, lobbying the powers in Europe and in Washington. And then the big change comes, which is the change in the US presidency. Obama had deep sympathies to Iran and was particularly antagonistic towards Saudi Arabia. Obama believed Saudi Arabia was to blame for much of the extremism and radicalization in the region. When Trump came, Trump was hell-bent on completely removing Obama's legacy, and indeed Trump conducted foreign policy as a businessman. So Saudi poured money in to lobby Trump, and Qatar poured money to lobby Trump. So when the blockade was taking place, when Trump appeared to give his approval on a visit to Riyadh, that he wouldn't mind the blockade on Qatar. Of course, James Mattis, later the defense minister, said this is a mistake and America shouldn't do that. The reality is that the US, instead of being an active party, decided to sit on the fence. It's not that they allowed the blockade, but they didn't really care about the blockade. And when you look at it from a US perspective, they're not bothered about it either. They retain full access to the military bases. Money is pouring in from Doha, money is pouring in from Riyadh, pouring in from Abu Dhabi, as they each try to lobby the US against one another. So all of the money is coming into Washington. So Washington sees no need really to rush to try to reconcile between the two parties. But going back to the main issue at hand, Saudi Arabia was facing an existential crisis in which Qatar was about to become the hegemon of the region by virtue of his allies being in power in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Libya, and possibly even in Yemen as well. That is compounded by Iran in Iraq to the northern border, Iran to the east, Qatar having some relations with Iran as well to the east. So anybody who looks at a map will see that Saudi Arabia quite simply felt surrounded. And moreover, President Morsi, may Allah rest his soul, President Morsi, when he was president of Egypt, for the first time in 25 years, Egypt received a sitting Iranian president. Ahmadinejad visited Iran and visited Egypt, and Egypt and Iran signed a number of tourism deals in what seemed like a rapprochement. For Saudi Arabia, this was the last straw. In other words, Muslim Brotherhood, traditionally antagonistic to Saudi Arabia. Qatar, believed to be for years antagonistic to Saudi Arabia and inviting a US military base to threaten Saudi Arabia. plus Iran. Saudi Arabia believed this was it. It needs hard measures, fierce measures. They blockaded Qatar. They helped to pump money into Trump to win Trump over. They pushed Trump to tear up the Iran nuclear deal. And this is why bin Salman reacted in this knee-jerk reaction. This is just a summary of why the blockade took place. Many people paint the blockade as one of authoritarianism versus democratic values. The reality is it's nothing like that at all. Qatar backed the Arab Spring because it knew that its allies, the Muslim Brotherhood, were in pole position to benefit from any democratic elections. If the Muslim Brotherhood were not in such a position, it's unlikely that Qatar would have given support to the Arab Spring in the manner that it did. And for Saudi Arabia, it's not about imposing authoritarianism. It's about Saudi Arabia trying to protect itself, trying to protect its current system, trying to protect its regime. What one feels about the regime, what you might feel about the regime, is irrelevant here. We're simply talking about realpolitik and pragmatism. Saudi regime felt under threat, and it was under threat, and it was facing an existential crisis. And this is why I said you have to picture yourself as an advisor to Saudi Arabia. What would you have advised King Abdullah in order to survive? What would you have advised the Saudi regime in order to survive? And the reality is, and it's the dark nature and crude nature of politics, and why the reality is that no solutions are generally found to some of the most difficult problems in the world. The crude answer is that in order to maintain power, Saudi needed to prevent the spread of the Arab Spring, and to do that, they needed to pressure Qatar, they needed to remove the Muslim Brotherhood. Whether it's right or wrong is irrelevant. The morality of it, we're not here to discuss the morality of it. Where the question was, why is Saudi continuing on the blockade? That's why Saudi Arabia is continuing on the blockade. Why is it continuing today with the blockade? It is because Saudi believes it's winning. Qatar no longer controls, has extensive influence over Egypt. The allies in Tunisia are struggling. Libya is now in a civil war. Former Qatar ally Omar Bashir, although he wasn't in his later days, Sudan now is under the influence of the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Yemen, UAE and Saudi Arabia are firmly the main powers in Yemen, albeit there is a bitter civil war. UAE is restoring relations in Syria. In other words, Qatar no longer has that expansive influence that it had in 2013 before Saudi Arabia and UAE launched the counterattack. So they want Qatar to come with its head humbled and say, I will not try to become the hegemon once more. And Qatar is saying, I still have a chance. I can have alliances with Iran. I can ally with Turkey. I can put money into Donald Trump and the US. And in the elections that the Democrat comes to power, it may well be that the Democrat puts pressure on Saudi Arabia instead of Qatar instead. And this is why we see the fierce lobbying in various different Western capitals. That's as brief as I could make it. There are other details, there are other intricate details, but that's the sum of it. Saudi Arabia thought it was an existential crisis. Qatar was about to become the main hegemon. Al Thani and Al Saud went to blows against one another. Al Nahyan jumped in with Al Saud, and that's what we're seeing here. A very tribal conflict that has ramifications for Libya, for Tunisia, even for Algeria at some point, for the region generally. If you found this of interest, don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to like the Facebook page. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter. And if you have any questions, anything in particular you'd like an explanation on, you'd like us to present some research on, don't hesitate to email us at contact@intlinterest.com. Thank you.